Well, welcome everybody to today's webinar on how to restructure your church staff wisely. We're really glad you joined us today. I think this is going to be a great conversation. Staffing and organizational structure has been a really hot topic with ministry leaders for the last couple of years. In fact, based on our most recent data, 53% of churches have gone through a restructuring involving multiple staff positions within the last 2 years. And we know sometimes it can actually go very wrong. So today we're going to share some wisdom that we've learned over many years of ministry and consulting with churches on how to restructure in a way that honors God and the people on your team. But before we get into today's content, I want to introduce my friends and panelists here with us today. First of all, we have Tony Morgan. Tony is the founder and lead strategist here at the Unstuck Group, and he started the Unstuck Group back in 2009. Since then, we've served nearly 700 churches throughout the United States and several other countries around the world. So, Tony, just wondering, as you introduce yourself to everyone who's tuned in, any personal stories come to mind on this topic of restructuring within the church?
Sean, only that it seems like every conversation I have with a pastor, though we certainly talk about some ministry strategy things and just future direction of the church, it seems like almost every conversation comes back to something related to staffing and leadership and getting the right people in the right roles. And so I know that this is a common challenge for a lot of the folks that are listening in today, and a great opportunity then because of that as well. So I'm looking forward to today's conversation.
Well, we also have our teammate, Amy Anderson, here with us too. Amy is the director of consulting here at the Unstuck Group. She's been here on the team since 2016. And during that time, she has personally served over 150 churches, helping them with ministry strategy, staffing, and multi-site strategy to really fuel their mission. So, Amy, you do a lot of this type of work with churches. Any personal stories come to mind for you?
I don't know if it's so much of a personal story as it is, I just have a passion for this. I've said on the podcast many times, a lot of the churches that I've been serving this past year, they feel stuck because they're growing and they're trying to figure out what's next. And as we dive into, their ministry planning, we look at their staffing and structure, oftentimes they're stuck due to their structure. Meaning, if they're really going to keep on this growth trajectory and reach more people, disciple more people, they really need to look at their structure and get those lanes cleaned up and get organized well. And because I've done this so much, I also have seen the other side and just how these teams have been released and have really become, they're doing the work that God has laid out for them and they're succeeding in it.
Yeah. We're talking about this today because people problems are really uniquely challenging on a ministry team. Leading your staff through them is hard, and we acknowledge that up front. There's nothing about this necessarily that's easy.
Well, Sean, nobody gives their life to ministry for the money. It's more than a job, and your team is more than a staff. And when you know something is off related to your team, I think it's normal to lack confidence for solving that kind of challenge. They didn't teach pastors how to do this kind of work in seminary. And honestly, I don't know about you guys, but I know I've been on the receiving end of a bad restructure at some point, and I think we all have. We've got some of that in our history. And I'll just say it again, the people that we serve alongside in ministry, they are more than a staff. They feel like family. So I just think the stakes are high. Make sure you do it wisely.
Yeah, Amy, that is so true. And I think it's that dynamic that obviously creates challenges for pastors. And because of that, we hesitate to move through restructuring that really we need for the benefit, not just of the ministry, but for the individuals involved. And because we hesitate, we start to we continue to retain people who may not be a good fit for either the role or for the team itself. And when we wait to address it, that can become unhealthy for the team, and it can lead to toxicity over time. And none of that is fun, because then even good people start to reconsider, do I want to be a part of the team and be a part of this mission? When we don't restructure, it also allows ministry silos to continue to form and creates misalignment over time. If we don't address the restructure, we're just allowing failures around character or chemistry or competence or culture fit to continue to go unaddressed. And none of that is healthy. And then we also let people continue to serve in areas of responsibility where they have ministry leadership and influence but possibly the growth of the church and the growth of the ministry has outgrown their capacity. And so in all of these areas, I think because we love people and we've built a team and we've started to create that family dynamic, our tendency is to hesitate. And in reality, we actually need to lean in and take the steps towards wise restructuring on our teams.
Yeah. And through our conversation today, we want to help you feel more confident in your ability to get the people side of ministry right. We help pastors build high impact teams structured to get stuff done with a culture of developing and empowering leaders within their church. And lately, many of the church leaders that have been reaching out to us have said one of these few things. One of the key leaders on their team just resigned, or they know they're going to need to let someone go in the near future. Several key leaders maybe are underperforming and they don't follow through on what they say they'll do. Sometimes they drop the ball. Their competency in their roles isn't improving like it should be. And yet it's hard to articulate a reason to transition people off the team. And this one is one I've heard a lot of lately personally. Their church is growing, but they don't think that their structure can support their growth. They need to hire 3, 4, maybe 6 leaders, and they don't really know what to do first. We've got a proven process that helps pastors get the people side of ministry right, and we're going to share all of that with you today. Specifically, we're going to ask you to make a commitment to yourself over the course of this conversation today that you will go in the wisest order when you plan your next restructure. And we're going to teach you that order today in terms of step 1, what we call discovery and assessment, step 2, structure and ministry alignment, and then step 3, very importantly, implementation. So that's the order we'll go through today's conversation in. Just a few last details before we get started, some of the logistics of today's webinar. Of course, we'll have chat and live Q&A going throughout the webinar today. You can submit questions to be considered for our live Q&A. Use that live Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. The chat feature sometimes is too hard to find the questions within all of the conversation there. So use that live Q&A button, and we'll be considering some of those for live Q&A at the end. We have a companion workbook to go along with today's conversation. You can find that at the unstuckgroup.com/workbook. Tiffany and Amy and I will be interacting via chat and helping to identify some of those questions. So if you have questions or conversations to do that, add those to the chat as we go. And of course, any of the questions we're not able to get through into the live Q&A today, we'll try to add those to some follow-up content. And then if you're on social media, specifically Twitter or X, I can't call it X, I still struggle with that, Twitter or Facebook, today, you can share our conversation using the hashtag UnstuckChurch. All right, so like I mentioned, step 1 in our order of conversation today is discovery and assessment. And we want the church leaders participating in today's conversation, so you guys on the other side of the webinar, to commit to taking the next restructure in the right order. So we'll kick off this webinar and this conversation talking about the first stage of a healthy restructure, discovery and assessment.
Yeah, so when we jump in with the church, that is our first priority, Sean, is assessment, because we want to understand our starting point. We want to understand where we have some strength, where we have some gaps. And so we do objective assessments and subjective assessments so that we know, again, what our starting point is. And one of the assessments I wanted to share today is just something we call staffing best practices. And so there are 9 best staffing practices that we've identified, and we just talk through each one of them and have the church reflect back, how do you think you're doing in this specific area? So let me just talk through a couple of them. Number 2 on our list is the best practice of having a structure that's aligned to core ministry strategies. And so I'll have the church just at first tell me about their ministry strategies so that I can actually have a voice into this too as I'm assessing against their structure. But if a church is healthy in this area, these are some of the evidences I see. First, the structure really reflects the core ministry strategies. And what I mean by that is the core reach strategies and the core spiritual formation strategies. And there are staff leaders, another evidence of health, that's designated as owners over those core ministry strategies. And every team member knows who and what they are accountable to. And lastly, new positions on the team, they're actually created out of strategy definition and necessity. Now, if we flip that, where I see evidences of unhealth is when the church is creating positions because a current staff member needs a new role or a new seat on the bus. In other words, they move people around instead of actually addressing that problem. Tony, you mentioned this just a few minutes ago, but when I see ministry silos, this is an evidence of unhealth that we are not aligning our ministries to our structure. Priorities tend to be unclear. Everything kind of feels equally important. And you can't name who owns the lead responsibility over key metrics and results. So, if I talk about weekend attendance, who's really the owner of that? When we talk about spiritual formation, who's actually the owner? So when those things aren't named, I know that this is a little wonky. Here's another best practice. Leadership roles are filled with equippers, not doers. This is something common that comes up in most of the staffing structures I do. So again, evidences of health that we have leaders in leadership roles. Team members with the leadership gift are in the leadership positions. We look at our vital signs metric. When we have leaders in leadership roles, then that percent of budget on staff should be between 45 and 55%. That's just an evidence that we're doing this right. And also, we have a healthy percentage of volunteers and volunteer leaders engaged in serving. And again, if I flip that, when we look for evidences of unhealth, one of the headlines is there is this constant sense that we need more staff because the first instinct to fill a ministry need is to hire someone. Here's another one. When I hear the room talk about how the same volunteers get tapped to serve whenever there's a need, that always comes up in vital signs when they're like, well, he serves here, here, and here. Do I count him once or three times? But when the same volunteers get tapped, that's an unhealthy practice. Or another evidence would be where some staff have just been promoted beyond their leadership abilities, which, by the way, feeds in just one more I'll share. Number 6, best practice is that leaders are intentionally developed. And an evidence of health here is when you have staff openings, if you're really intentionally developing leaders, when you have that opening, you actually have several internal candidates to consider because both staff and volunteers have been raised up to be great leaders. And an evidence of unhealth is where when we assess our team, we notice that people have done the same thing for many years without really much change in results and effectiveness. So, there's 9 of them, but, many churches never assess at this detail level. But it's so important because as an organization, leaders have a shared, when this is clear, when we know what our best practices are and we evaluate them, leaders have this shared understanding and common language for what the wins are for staffing and structure. And if I can, let me just show you one example from a church where we did this assessment. So we went through each of these staffing best practices, and you can see they've got their governance in line there. And they actually, number 7 there, are great at, championing both performance and health. But if you start to look where we're turning red, number 6 there, leaders are intentionally developed. Their communication systems aren't healthy. And 2 and 3 then also, are just on that edge of still being red. So this helps us inform as we get into the end of the engagement, when we get to action, where we really need to put our attention for the next 12 months. How are we going to get more of these best practices in line and turning green?
Tony, I wonder if you could share just some of the other critical components of this discovery and assessment stage.
I will, but first things first, I think we need Amy to help us clearly understand what is wonky and how do we know whether something is too wonky, not enough wonky? What do you think, Amy?
Is that a Minnesota wonky? Or
Y'all don't say that? You don't use the word wonky? Messed up, man.
No. I love it. Yeah, Sean, the key here, we want to understand before we dive into restructuring, what is the health of the church and what is the health of the team. And so a couple of key tools that we look at during this discovery and assessment phase of the process are vital signs. First of all, we want to know what's healthy, what's thriving in the context of the entire church's ministry right now. And then where might be some issues that are developing related to the church's ministry that it could be a strategy fix, but many times we find it's because the structure isn't in place correctly to help move that area of the ministry forward. And so with the vital signs assessment, we're looking at some of the basic things, of course, like attendance and giving, but then more specifically in areas of group connection, serving connection, volunteer leaders. How many volunteer leaders are we raising up? Engagement in different aspects of the ministry. Then also comparing reach metrics with spiritual formation metrics. So there are a number of different metrics that we look at in vital signs. Just to, again, give us a quick overview of the health of the ministry itself. Then we look into, it's really an objective assessment, but looking at the health of the team, where we can measure personal health and team health, personal performance and team performance. We look at the culture of the team, and then some of the systems we're using as a team to accomplish the ministry that God's given us. And so these two tools that we've developed really do give us a great picture of both the health of the church itself, but also the health of the team. Another assessment that we leverage in this part of our process, it's leading from your strengths. It's a great tool. Amy and I were just commenting in recent months, we probably now, because we've had so many church leaders take leading from your strengths, probably have the most in-depth perspective of what ministries, how ministry leaders are shaped in different roles and how they fit in the kind of the diverse experience and wiring that they bring to teams. And it's great because it gives us a clear picture of the individual wiring of the churches that we're working with, and helps us to identify where maybe there are some gaps on the team that could be filled as we go through the restructuring process. And then Amy, you've been using Working Genius pretty often in recent months as well. Can you share a little bit about how those two tools are similar and maybe some of the key differences between those two tools?
Yeah, there's a lot of assessments out there that teams can use. There's also Clifton Strength Finders, and I think all of them have just a little bit of a different job description. What I love about leading from your strengths is, number one, it looks at those natural wirings when it comes to things like processing information, solving problems. Then it gives you a punchline at the end. And, it's not so much the individual assessment in that activity, but it's looking at, do we have the diversity of strengths that we need on our team? Or are we all super similar? Where Working Genius, this is less about personality and it's more about productivity, how the work gets done. So I find Working Genius actually helpful for ministry teams to see, do we have the geniuses that it takes to not only initiate work, but to land it and finish it well. So I intersperse those depending on the church and what the greater need is, but both are excellent tools.
And then lastly, just as we look at assessment of the church itself, we really want to get a clear understanding of the ministry strategies that each church is engaging, because they look a little bit different with every church that we work with. And so understanding what are the church's reach strategies for reaching people outside the church and outside the faith. Understanding the church's spiritual formation strategy. So once people connect to the church, how is that church helping people take their next steps towards Jesus? Thinking about next generation strategies. So how are we ministering to preschoolers, to kids, to students, and how does that fit with our overall ministry to families? What is the strategy for carrying out future vision? Because our assumption is there's a future direction that the church believes God's called them to. And of course, we want to understand strategically, what does that look like, so that when we start to dive into the restructuring itself, we can make sure that we're building a structure that helps the church accomplish its vision strategy, its family ministry strategies, its reach strategies, its spiritual formation strategies. And it's not unusual in that conversation for churches to start to raise questions because they sense we don't have clarity in these areas. And it very well could be that one of the reasons why they don't have clarity is because they don't have a structure, a team built to actually give focus to each of these core areas of ministry strategy. So, Sean, those are some of the assessments that we work through during this discovery and assessment step.
Amy, besides just natural strengths, what other ways should churches be assessing their current team in this phase?
Yeah, the last two assessments that come to mind that I think every church should lean into before they go into a restructure is just an assessment of overall performance of each person, as well as an assessment of their current and future leadership capacity. So, when we're on site, we go through this diagnostic conversation around the performance of each team member. I've probably said this before, but it used to just bug me years ago when a highly visible church leader would talk to a crowd of other church leaders and say things like, every year we rate our employees, we identify our A's, B's, and C's, and we fire the C's. And I would just shake my head because that is such a short-sighted and irresponsible way, I think, to deal with employee performance. I think employee performance processes like this set you up to actually coach your team better. I mean, a lot of us are in ministry. We don't come arrived in all of these skills. People like on my team, I go, God's put them in my care. It's my job to be diagnostic about where are they winning, where are their gaps, and how can I help them? So our process is much more diagnostic than A, B, and C. And here, let me just show you an example. And I have changed the names to protect the innocent. But before I actually look at the results of this assessment, you can see up there, we're looking at the basics, right? Character, chemistry, competence. This church didn't have their culture defined yet, so I wasn't able to help them with this. But let me talk about the outcome of a conversation like this. I think it is so helpful for the lead pastor or the senior leaders, because here's the truth. The lead pastor really only sees one side of the employee, but they rarely see the full picture. I guess that could be said about every leader, but the senior leader sits in a unique seat and everyone wants to have a good face for them. So when you have a conversation with a small group of leaders, there's just great learnings, both positive and sometimes discouraging as we talk about our leaders. But you can tell in this exercise by looking at this chart, it has such a great reveal. And it gives pastors confidence when they're considering promoting someone to a higher level leadership role. And it also gives them confidence when they have to lean in on a tough conversation. So you can see employee A and employee I, neither of them were thriving in any of those areas, character, chemistry, and competence. And the church leader kind of knew this coming into the conversation. But when you see the span of score from 18 to their top performer there at 648, then you're like, we have some real issues. You look at the two top performers, B and J, then you're going to start to go, well, those are the people we maybe should lean into and look at their leadership capacity next. And should we be doing something different with them? And for the rest of them, it just gives you, again, this is how I can coach this person. For instance, if we look at employee E there, they have great character. They're competent in their role. I actually think this person was newer to their role, which is why that competency number is a little lower. But if you look at the chemistry score at 5, that just tells me this person has some blind spots that they need a good manager to coach them through so they can see what it's like to be on the other side of them. Because nobody wants to be outside the normal curve when it comes to chemistry. But the truth is we all do things that we can't see in ourselves. Vice versa, if you look at employee F, competence is great, but look at that character score. That's an intervention conversation. Character is such a huge thing, well, anywhere in life, but leading a ministry, that's got to either be turned around or we're not going to move forward with that. So all that to say, clarity is a word I hear every time I go through this conversation. Brings clarity to the right next moves that the church needs to make from a personnel standpoint. And then quickly, lastly, we just talked through current and future leadership capacity on the team. So we're going to look at this leadership capacity chart and talk about who are our doers today, who are our people who are more like modeling for people how to do ministry, who's actually leading other people, responsible for them, building teams, and then who is leading other leaders. And then we look at that conversation and go, and who has upward potential. But those two conversations really create a picture of who you should be investing in your restructure, plus a solid basis for ongoing coaching.
All right. So as we wrap up this part of the conversation in step 1, I'm sharing a URL on the screen right now. And what I'd like you to do is just take a few moments, go to that URL and download the full staffing best practices overview document with the evidences of health and unhealth. So you can hang on to that for future reference. So just take a few moments, go to that URL, download the document, and we'll be back with step 2. Okay, let's move on to a really critical part of the process, and that's drafting the potential future structure and potential staffing changes. And importantly, we don't recommend that you start with people. Tony, can you unpack a little bit of the why behind that?
Yeah, it doesn't even make sense, right? If we're talking structure, why don't we start with people? But the reality is, in fact, I was just with a church in recent weeks, and they acknowledge this is what we've done. Most churches actually look at who do we have, and then with those people, figure out what can we do. And then as a result of that, try to determine what role should we put them into. In other words, what should we have those folks do to accomplish the mission that God's given us? In reality, we just think it needs to be flipped. We almost have to flip the funnel. And in other words, let's figure out what's the mission God's called us to, and what strategy do we need to engage to accomplish that mission? Then what roles do we need to activate it? And then who fits into those roles? Who do we have on our team that can fit into those different roles? And then who do we need to find to fill the gaps that might exist so that we can accomplish the strategy that will then fulfill the mission and the direction that we're heading as a ministry? And I get it. This is really hard to do because our natural tendency is to start to look at the people we have, and really with the people we have, it's like we're family. And so one of the things that pastors always tell me is that our Unstuck team really does help walk through this process, thinking strategy. Who do we need to activate? What are the roles that we need to fill so that we can stay focused on the objective of accomplishing our mission as a church?
Amy, practically speaking, what all needs to happen before a church starts making decisions about specific people?
Yeah, well, we talked about that diagnostic evaluation. Also, I think you need to define your culture. We call them culture shaping behaviors. So how does our team behave? But when it really gets to the structure piece that Tony's talking about, when we need to get to our roles first, how I often coach a church is before we start talking about our next move in structure, let's talk about if we doubled in size, what would our team look like? And so when we do that, you start to get informed on what are the roles that we need to begin thinking about bringing on board, because it's going to help us grow into that for the future. So let me show you a current org chart right now, which we started with, and you can kind of see how they're aligned. And of course, we'll validate some of the ministry strategies against that, but let's jump to when we ask them to double their size. In this one, you can see we actually got ministry lanes cleaned up, and we talked about what are the strategic roles we need, not the people. Forget about the people. By the way, when you double your size, it's easier to put people down because you can't imagine that you'll actually be there in any time soon. So it helps scrub it a little bit. But we'll double the size and get those roles down. And then what I encourage churches to do as we back up into, based on these roles, what's going to be the next move that we make. We want to really define the purpose of each role and the desired outcomes. For example, a lot of us have groups directors that ended up on this chart. So just a simple phrase like this will be our key leader to develop the strategies and systems that engage 55% or more of our attendees to engage in small groups. So that's an important thing. Then we know what the role is, and we're not muddying it by who our current maybe groups associate is. Another step we need to do is review budget impact and doability of a future structure. And then you can see in this chart where we doubled the size, we have to start to assess the FTE allocations for each team. And for the first time ever that I've known of, we finally have some data in this area. The last 2 years we have done in our quarterly Unstuck Church report, we now have some comparatives. So you can see, how do most churches allocate their staff in the area of operations or in spiritual formation, in the weekend, in the communications area, etc.? So you can kind of look and say, are we overstaffed or understaffed? If you go back to the first org structure I showed you, their current structure, compared to our norms, they were off. And so that informed, as we restructure, as we move forward, how do we need to allocate the positions so that we aren't way overstaffed, say in adult ministries, and way understaffed in family, or way overstaffed in ministry and way understaffed in reach. So it just reveals things like that. So that's some of the work you do as you're looking at this ministry side of it.
Tony, before we start confirming and implementing the plan, what else needs to happen in this structure and ministry alignment phase?
Yeah, Sean, that's a great question. And I think initially we have to think about development plans for a couple different people. One, development plan for the staff that have been underperforming, but they're a fit for the team and we see potential in them, and just making sure we have clear next steps and coaching planned to help that person move from where they are to reach their full potential, and make sure their contribution is where it needs to be to help us accomplish our mission. And then we also have to think about development plans for the people that we've identified that really have growing leadership potential, and how are we going to help them develop as leaders to grow their leadership influence so that, again, we can maximize their capacity to help us accomplish our mission. And so thinking intentionally about what are the development plans, both for those that are underperforming and those that have more leadership capacity in them, so that we can think about the next steps of engaging those conversations and that coaching. And then, Sean, I really do think we have to be very intentional about what the rollout's going to look like for any future structure changes, because we want to make sure we're honoring God and the members of our team. And so we need to be thoughtful about what the timing of conversations is going to look like. Who are we going to be talking with? What is the information that they need to have, and in the right sequence too? And that's why when we work with churches through this part of the process, we make sure that we have a phased approach that's thinking about the right conversations with the right people, that actually helps them implement the structure changes that they are agreeing we need to be making. But then thinking about even beyond, once the structure changes are happening, how do we live into this new structure? What does that look like? What does the meeting flow look like with the teams that we're developing? How do we make sure that these intentional conversations around development plans for underperformers and growing leadership capacity, what does that look like? And so when we help a church think through structure changes, we're not just helping them get to the change itself. We're helping them think about the conversations and the process of leading through that change.
All right, before we move on to step 3, there's another URL on your screen. And this is a link for an example of a church org chart today and the church org chart at double its size. So we're going to take just a few minutes, give you an opportunity to go to that link, download those church org charts if you'd like to take a closer look at that. All right, and then lastly, step 3, implementation. Amy, let's talk about when it's time to make decisions and really start implementing the plan.
Yeah, well, once you've done the work of determining your destination, you have those positions there. And once you've done the work of confirming those positions, like I talked about a few minutes ago, now you're ready to really put names in those positions. And I won't get into all of that because that's a very personal, work for a church. But it's important to keep track of who's going to be affected by each decision. And then once you have that, as Tony was just talking about, you need to develop your rollout and communication plans. And just here's some things you need to be thinking through. What are the new meeting rhythms that need to be established? What's the key messaging that all of the leaders will speak from as you communicate the changes? Things like what triggered the reorganization? What are the benefits? You have to get a go live date. So when are we actually going to be going into this new structure? What are the sequence of communications? And, Tony, I think you wrote in Simply Strategic Stuff, you need to hire slow and fire fast. In this process, what we've been talking about with implementation is you need to do all this work and you need to go slow so that you take time to think through everything. But once you've got your go live date, you need to move fast. You don't kind of just nitpick at structure changes. You need to go fast at that point. And then I always encourage churches, think through the extras. Is there a fun way to launch this new structure? Do new teams need to plan getting some initial time together? And part of all this laundry list of things really depends on if your restructure ends up being a tweak to what you're doing or if it's a significant overhaul. And just to give you an example, I worked with a church this year that did a restructure for the first time since their current lead pastor had been put in place. So it was overdue. And all those things I just mentioned, they thought through all those things as they worked through their reorg. They had clarity on the destination. They worked through the people names, and then they spent time thinking through this rollout in a detailed communication plan, meaning they thought through the order of the communications and who would be in the room for these meetings. And Sean, I'm just going to have you put up their plan. Again, names have been changed, but I'm sharing it just to show you how intentional they were about who was going to be met with and when. And, there's always instances where maybe you have a long timer and we need to let them in first. Anyways, they thought through it all. So I actually did a debrief with them yesterday, and they just said they were so thankful that they had gone through all of that work, because in the midst of the rollout, they got thrown some curveballs, which is normal. But all that pre-work really helped them to know how to pivot and how to get the work done. And I think the reason this church had such a successful restructure was because of their intentionality around each step.
Yeah, and Amy, along these lines, I mean, you've shared so much good information, and you just rattled through a great list of some things that churches need to be thinking about. But because there's so much information and there's so many details and so many next steps that we're helping churches through, one of the things I love about our process when it comes to staffing and structure is we almost give churches a playbook of how to approach the next steps that they're making. In fact, maybe you could share just a sample of what those summary reports look like.
Yeah, let me share this one here, and I've hopefully whited out everything I should white out. This is just a portion of the report. You can see we're already on page 8 of this summary, but it goes through, more detail on each of the phases of the structure changes that they're going to be making. And there's specific notes for each of these phases, what they need to be doing. So they don't have to remember all these things. It gives them a roadmap of what they need to pick up. Of course, we go into org charts, and then we get into what are the priority next steps over the next 30 days, 90 days, and the next 12 months. But I think you need a plan like this so you can confirm your work. You can get all of your lead team members on the same page, because talking about changes is one thing, but putting the plan together, I think, really crystallizes a well thought out change.
Yeah. And in addition to that, I really would recommend over the last month, Amy and I have been talking through the basics of what healthy structuring looks like. And so the podcast series, we called it Staffing Wisdom for Church Leaders. Lots of practical examples and some hopefully good wisdom to help you with some next steps in this area. But again, I get it. Pastors, church leaders, we don't commonly work through staff restructuring like this. And I wanted today for us to be able to share some of the specifics. When we help churches through restructuring, this is what it looks like. I wanted you to see a sample of that summary report, because I really do think there would be value for us coming alongside you if you're sensing a restructuring is necessary, to hire our team to help you through that restructuring itself.